Good evening and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page. A place where we just like to talk narrative. In this case, we read old folk tales and fairy tales on Tuesday nights, but Thursday nights we also do a ride-along stream. If you've never been here before, or you've never seen this show before, and you came in on the sort of surge that the last video had, we won't be doing any writing tonight. We'll be reading traditional old tales. But I just realized I left my air conditioner on, so you guys are going to have to be occupied for 20 seconds while I go and turn it off. My apologies for that, but for those of you on TV, you probably don't even hear it, but for those on headphones, it's a low hum in the background. Now, what we're talking about tonight is Dr. Faust. I've actually never heard him referred to as a doctor, but apparently that is his traditional title. Faust, the way you'd probably know him best, is as the origin of the term Faustian bargain. And so I'm going to talk to a little bit of background on him here, but if you're not the kind of person who cares at all, you're like, just get to the stories, man. Down in the description below, there will be timestamps if you're not watching this live, and you can jump ahead to the beginning of the story. We're going to read, well, I'm going to say 3 stories, but truthfully, there's a bunch of little short snippets in these stories and one longer story, all relating to sort of pact partners with the devils, namely Dr. Faust for the most part, and then one tale to sort of contrast and show what traditionally those tales look like and why Faust is a bit different. But yeah, timestamps in the description below. If you want to skip ahead, skip all of that. Every story tonight, too, I'll mention this several times, comes from our collections that were originally collected in German that have only quite recently been translated by Jürgen Hubert, who is a German folklore translator. He runs a Patreon, which I will have a pinned comment when this video is no longer live, where you can go and support him on his Patreon, Sunken Castles Evil Poodles, which is the name of the collection. You should definitely do that. You get stories every month for just a couple of bucks. It's one of the cheaper Patreons you'll see, and the value I think you'll see is quite high. So let's talk Dr. Faust. I'm just going to spend like 2 or 3 minutes talking a little bit about who he is as a person and who he is as a literary figure, and then we'll get right into the stories. But I do think a frame is necessary because I don't want to assume everyone knows who Faust is or what a Faustian bargain is. But if you do know that, timestamps in the description. So, who is he? First of all, there does seem to be a real Faust. There does seem to be a person who is associated to that name from the 15th century, most likely living into the 16th century. His actual name is a matter of debate, but it seems to be Johann Georg Faust. And depending on the account you trust, it's either he was born in 1480 or born in 1466. There is a theory, according to the Wikipedia, I'm not pretending to be a scholar here, by the way, there is a theory that it might have been 2 people going by the name Faust because it was popular. At root, he's a German itinerant alchemist, astrologer, and magician from the German Renaissance. Now, that magician part is the part that will come to matter because the thing that Faust is known for is taking deals with devils. And that's not surprising since around the time when there was a Christianization in Germany, a lot of old magic users got reframed as people who took deals with devils. So, who he actually is or was as a magician or an alchemist or whatever he was, is pretty obscured. because there are literally centuries of fable, folklore, and legend around him that make it hard to know what would be an accurate account of his actual life. That said, as a literary figure, he represents the basic idea of selling your soul to the devil for power and pleasures. More abstractly, though, he represents a bad deal. If somebody says a Faustian bargain, what they're saying is that you're getting something with much less value for what you lose, what you gave away. In the case of Faust, it's his soul. He gives his soul away in all versions of the tale. He gives his soul away. Something that is unique to the Faustian bargain tropes is that Faust usually doesn't get out of the deal with the devil. Now, this is a crucial difference in most lore, and we're going to look at one example of this, either by their own wits or the wits of some magic wise person, whether that's a witch or a priest or whatever else. They tend to get out of the contract with the devil. So, in other words, they outsmart the devil in some way with some loophole or whatever else. But Faust is different. Despite its most famous telling being Goethe's Faust, where I believe he actually does redeem his soul in Goethe's Faust by striving to be better, the Faust of fable almost never gets out of the deal. All right. I see Jenna and GS are there. Hello, Jenna and GS. So, we're going to be looking at Selling Your Soul to the Devil tales. We're going to look at a collection of Dr. Faust tales. And then what we're going to do is we're going to read a longer story called The Smith of Mitterbach, who, as the note from Jürgen Hubert, the translator says, a person too blasphemous for both heaven and hell. That's my catch on that. It is truly one of the best stories in the entire Sunken Castles Evil Poodles collection, and we'll read it last. It is the most cohesive and long tale, but I'm reading it specifically as a contrast to show how Faust stands out as a trope. Was that 3 minutes? I think I managed to keep that around 3 or 4 minutes. It's good to see people in the chat. If you want to join us in the chat, you're welcome to. But we may as well get to our stories. I'm going to take the music down just a touch. Take the fireplace down a touch. And we are going to add a little atmosphere. Now, all of these are very short, so my effective atmospheres are going to be a little more limited. But let's do some light rain. Has a little bit of atmosphere. And of course, let me know if any of the sound is troubling, topping out, or otherwise unlistenable. Our first tale comes to us, as all of them will, from a collection of translations by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support at the Patreon in the pinned comment. And this tale is called The Tale of Dr. Faust, and it's several little fables about this eponymous character. Faust once wanted to make a chain out of grains of sand, but when he failed to do so, he decided to sign himself over to the devil so that the latter would be of service to him. But it was part of the deal that the contract according to which the devil could fetch Faust after a certain time, would be void if Faust managed to frighten the devil. Faust was content with this. After he had tried many times in vain, he once caused a bell to suddenly ring next to the ears of the devil, but the devil did not startle due to this either. It was then that Faust realized that he would not be able to escape the devil. The devil was also willing to relinquish his claim if Faust was able to make a girl laugh. So Faust took the girl in and loved her. However, the devil put the girl in a deep sleep, and thus she was not aware of anything that happened to her. and therefore she did not laugh either. When the allotted time was over, as allotted by the contract, the devil appeared. Faust was sitting at the meal table at that moment and wanted to have one more day of vacation to enjoy the pleasures of the table. But the devil grasped him and threw him through the wall so that blood splattered everywhere. Then the devil soared away with Faust. I mean, that's a good outro to a little story. Jenna says that's such a weird thing to sell your soul over. No kidding. Don't worry, they get weirder. Fable 2 about Dr. Faust. Dr. Faust once had his coachman harness the horses, and when the horses were standing in front of the table, and the coachman had climbed on the box, I'm assuming that meant to be stable, by the way, Faust lifted the coach into the air without the coachman noticing this. Then he put the coach on a bridge of paper and ordered the coachman to drive onwards, while the coachman cracked his whip in order to drive the horses onward, but the whip got stuck on something and was unable to swing it further. The coachman wanted to climb off, untangle the whip, but Faust told him that he should stay on the coach, as he would be unable to free the whip. The coachman could only be convinced to obey Faust with this Faust on that, with the great difficulty. Now Faust jumped out of the wagon, put it back down on the ground again, told the coachman to remove the horses from the harness, and then showed him that the whip was stuck at the top of a church tower. The village where this has occurred allegedly derived its name from this instance, for Pates is meant to be the name of the whip, Paste of the coachman. Now, if you're wondering, what the hell was that? I'm sure there is some reason why that makes sense. Why was he on a paper bridge? I see Chad is already getting confused. They don't make sense. They just occur. That's not my only tale of Faust, though. You see, before the devil retrieved Faust, the latter invited his friends to a grand evening meal for the last time. And as they were in the middle of the feast, the devil stepped forward to the table and wanted to fetch Faust. But Faust pleaded with him to give him another half-hour grace period. But the devil told him that he had given him enough trouble and took Faust with him. Well, the friends continued to feast and drink until they sank beneath the table in inebriation. And when they woke up the next morning, they all were lying in an open field in the deepest dirt. I'm laughing because I know Chad is going to be like, what does that mean? I mean, that last one I think makes sense to me. I think what it's saying is that all the pleasures of the devil are illusions, I guess. I don't know what the stuck in the tower bridge of paper one was, though. Okay. Our last tale about Dr. Faust. By the way, this will be on the shorter side. Our last tale of the night. This isn't our last tale about... this is our last tale about Dr. Faust, not our last tale of the night. Our last tale is a longer tale, and it's a hell of a ride. But it definitely is shorter tonight. And part of that was I've considered putting more stories in that weren't related. And I don't know, I like the purity of just talking about Faust and then contrasting it. And besides, the last two varietal shows, my Thursday shows, ran for 2 hours almost, which is not how they're supposed to go. And I feel like this is me regaining a bit of time. all of that's excuses. Nothing really fit. By the way, there are a lot of tales about Faust, but most of them get pretty repetitive. So this one is unique because it references a thing called a Nitz. Now, a Nitz here is not really a typical thing, and the translator postulates that it's probably borrowing from Nordic myth of some sort, which does have a character similarly named. They're kind of like kobolds, but for those who have seen my kobolds before D&D video, German kobolds are traditionally not angry little things with lizard origins. They can be associated with mines, but more typically, or at least, that's not a guarantee, and this one tends to fit more the house spirit kind of thing. But the theory here is that a Nitz is a reference to a kobold not associated to a house, but a boat, which is something more from Nordic myth. So this is called Dr. Faust and the Nitz. And it is, again, from the collection Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which is a collection of translations from Jürgen Hubert, who you can support in the pinned comment below. Dr. Faust once had the Nitz in his service. With him, he traveled over the ocean along the coasts within a box made out of glass in order to observe all depths and shallows. He noted everything he saw through his glass box down on paper for the nautical charts. And the charts which the captains and helmsmen use and on which everything is mapped out originated with Dr. Faust in his glass box boat. But one day, when they reached a ferry point close to the entrance of Flensburg, the glass box was in danger of sinking. It was then that Dr. Faust shouted, "Hol Nitz!" Or halt Nitz. For the Nitz was not supposed to move the glass box further, as there was no path ahead, and instead brought the ship to a halt. And since that time, this place is called the Holnitz Fier, or the ferry point of Holnitz. And you'll notice that the commentary there, he says, this is Jürgen's commentary. It says, the Nitz in this story is apparently a variant of the Scandinavian Nis, a kobold-like entity. Given its nautical environment, it should probably be seen as identical with the German, and I don't have the pronunciation for this, so Klaubautermann, a shipboard spirit, which he has no tails on, but he may eventually. So we see in Dr. Faust, this last Dr. Faust story is just a weirdness associated with Dr. Faust, obviously. But we see in the first two Dr. Faust stories, we see a trend. And the trend is this. Dr. Faust, for some unknown reason, sells his soul to a devil. Different accounts later on, literary accounts. The most famous for me, anyways, is Goethe. I think there is somebody else who made a fairly famous account of Faust. They associate it to him, getting money to drink or gamble or knowledge is usually, because he gets associated a lot with knowledge, worldly things, right? And it's always for a certain period of time. But again, what makes Faust unique is he sells his soul to the devil, and the devil gets his soul. Traditionally, though, that's not how these tales go. Usually it's a setup where they outsmart the devil. And so the last story of the night is going to be the Smith of Mitterbach. And it is an example of a classic pack story. It has a lot of the tropes in it that you would associate with classic devil pack stories, especially from this region of the world, I should say, not that region of Germany. But one thing I will say, though, it has an unusual ending, which I think is part of what makes it such a cool story. It is a phenomenally interesting story. You don't have to agree with me on that. Sometimes I say that and people get kind of bitter if it's doesn't live up to their expectations. But I do understand that, folklore in general has a bit of a predictable cadence to a lot of it, although it does weird things. This story didn't go any direction I expected, but in a way that kind of made sense. Like it challenges some of the tropes of devil packs and how much they affect people and whatever else, and has just the wildest ending that I did not see coming. So, the point of this story in this series of stories is to contrast Dr. Faust, to show how what is similar and what is different. And the story is called The Smith of Mitterbach. And it is actually the first story in Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles. So I'm going to take that as a sign that Jurgen agrees with me that this story might be the best in the bunch. Before I move on to that, though, I see some comments. GS says, yeah, more boats up north than in Germany, especially Norway. I don't know if my Canadian or really anyone outside of that area has ever looked on a map of Norway, but it is a cobweb of rivers and lakes and lagoons and pieces of the ocean and whatever else mixed in with some spots of land, really. Like, it's a very, very nautical area. Jenna says, one of my friends was the artist on a modern take of the Faustian tale called Bee Haunted. Bee spelled B-E-A. If you wanted to check out a fun take on Faust. Is that something on YouTube, Jenna? Or is that something that people would have to pay for? And if so, where? Okay. Let's get a little bit of a tavern going here, because he's one to carouse. The next story is called The Smith of Mitterbach, and it comes to us again as a translation from Jürgen Hubert from his collection Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, which you can support in the pinned comment below. Now, many, many years ago, there was a smith living in Mitterbach who was bad, so bad, at maintaining his household and lost all his money to drinking and gambling. Eventually, he was so desperate for money that he called on the evil adversary himself for aid. Thus summoned the devil appeared, and the foolish smith dedicated himself to the latter with body and soul by his own blood signature. The devil should have him, as long as he, the devil, would serve that smith for 3 years in all matters. Well, the smith now thoroughly enjoyed himself. In a manner that astonished the whole neighborhood. But when the 3 years had passed, Lucifer appeared in the living room of the smithy, and he wanted to sit down on the bench near the oven. Well, the smith's wife prevented this by fetching him an upholstered chair from the guest room with an exaggerated politeness. Lucifer asked after her husband, and she replied that her husband was shoeing the innkeeper's horses at the inn. But This was merely a woman's stratagem, for in his fear and desperation, the smith had told his wife about his dark secret. Well, his wife provided the evil one with plenty of good food and drink. And pretended to send their journeyman to the smith. Well, the smith was actually visiting an old grandmother living in the village. You can read that as witch. I think actually later they call her a witch. And asking her for advice. For she was a wise woman, a skilled diviner, and a witch. There it is. Thus the smith came back to the smithy in a cheerful mood and asked Satan politely, "Please, sir, extend my lifespan." But the devil flatly denied this and admonished him to leave with him down to the bowels of hell. Well, as they walked through the garden behind the house where the cherry trees were full of red fruits, the smith asked the devil as a last request to climb on one of the trees and hand him some cherries. Well, since the devil believed the smith's will to be broken, he agreed to the request, but while he was on that tree, the smith drew a circle around the tree with a miraculous white chalk that wise woman had given him. And Satan sat on the tree branch as if he'd been glued to it. The smith called up to him and told him to throw down their contract. Afterwards, he would be released from the binding, and so the Duke of Hell, the Archduke of Hell, the King, the Prince of Demons, he refused it. And it went on for many hours, until finally the devil had a thought, clever as he was. He threw a forged contract down to the waiting smith, but the smith, well, can't scam a scammer. He recognized the scam. Thus the devil spent 6 hours on his aerial perch, baring his teeth, wailing, and spreading an indescribable stench. However, the hour of ghosts was about to end. That's midnight, by the way, the hour of ghosts. And that evil one now risked losing his reign forever, for some reason, which wore him down, as can readily be imagined. What would he have left? So he unscrewed his horn and took out a yellowed piece of parchment and threw it down to the smith with contempt. Well, the smith recognized it as his handwriting and tore it into 1,000 pieces. Then he used black chalk with curious properties to draw a circle around. And after that, Satan was gone like a wind, spreading as he left a great stench. But those who've once made deals with hell have already succumbed to it. Now, this was the first point where the story caught my attention as unique. Because that's not the end. You see, he's not able to extricate himself. That was a pretty good 3 years. So it was also true for our smith that he could not extricate himself. And so he called on the devil again. And he made a deal. In this time, the fleeced and burned Satan took great care not to be cheated out of his reward again. After the time was over, the poor sinner requested 3 final wishes, please, before he had to leave his dear wife and children. If he received those wishes, though, then he would be gladly willing to leave for hell. And so the wife, she joined in the pleading, and the young, apple-cheeked daughters that apparently he doesn't care about because he keeps signing deals with the devil that involve a time span where he doesn't see them grow up. They stroked the goat foot's hairy cheeks and pleaded dearly as well. Well, the old curmudgeon couldn't resist and softened to agree to this request. It's a bit of an odd characterization. The first request the smithy made of the devil as one of his final 3 wishes was that overnight all fields, meadows, grazing grounds, and hills belonging to the smith should be surrounded by walls 10 feet high and 5 foot thick and made out of ashlar-shaped stones. This request was easily accomplished in full by the devil, and as the smith arose in the morning and walked around his property, the wall was as magnificent as could be imagined. Then the smith mounted his gray horse, which was as fast as the wind, and told the black one to pave the path in front of him as he rode, and to remove the path behind him just as quickly. This too was accomplished, even though the smith rode until the horse died from exhaustion. And now the smith had no more ideas and went to that wise woman in the village again. Can you imagine that conversation? I did it again. She told him to give the evil one a lock of the very curly hair on his head and tell him to hammer out its kinks. Happy to have received such advice, the smith plucked out a lock and gave it to the God be with us. The devil hammered on it for a long time until he recognized the impossibility of this undertaking. Full of anger and frustration, he vanished while uttering a multitude of threats. The smith, made blind, not literally blind, made blind and brazen by such deliverance from his fate, signed himself over for the 3rd time, and now no more tricks would work. He had to go to hell without recourse. Now, in hell, there is a place intended for those who have not done anything so foul as murder, who have committed no robbery or any other atrocities, at least major ones, but only spent their life's time drinking and gambling and pursuing other distractions. There the merry brethren sit in a pitch-black, smoke-filled chamber, which is lit only by small pieces of kindling. It's not all bad, though. They drink beer and schnapps. They sniff Brazilian tobacco, which is apparently at the time considered quite good. They smoke Draconis cigars, which apparently was a brand at that time, so this might be product placement. Play cards and dice games, but they cheat each other, fight with each other, and reconcile with each other, and sing all sorts of drinking songs. And the devils, well, they have to pour out and clean up, but due to their inborn maliciousness, they sometimes pinch the players with their red-hot pliers and otherwise bully them in all sorts of ways, and the players are unable to protect themselves, nor are they able to take revenge against these pests. Well, when the smith arrived in the smoky chamber with his smithing tools in his knapsack, accompanied by the High Devil himself, all of the players were delighted at meeting him since they heard funny stories about how the smith had tricked their new lord and master. He immediately sat down at a table, and after an initial round of drinks, he started to play with the others. But soon he was distracted by those devils with their red-hot pincers, and they did not intend to leave him in peace with their devilries. He thus grabbed his hammer, his smithing hammer that he had brought with him, and bludgeoned the little horned men around the room. And after a heroic fight, stuck them all into his knapsack, after which he continued to pinch them with their own red-hot pliers. They cried for mercy, and the Duke of Hell himself released the smith because he was too unruly for even hell. Well, the smith proudly threw the knapsack with the badly maltreated little devils into a corner, said a fond farewell to his cheerful companions, and quickly left, holding hammer and pliers in his fist. The smith now walked towards heaven, and in his usual style, all the grace that defined him in life, he knocked on heaven's gate with a hammer. But St. Peter refused to open heaven's gates for him. Then the smith got angry, and so he pushed the gates of heaven itself open by force, grabbed St. Peter, and threw him down the ladder to heaven, and proceeded onwards until he faced God himself. And God called to him, "Begone, unrighteous one, and wander for all eternity. You don't belong in heaven and are not suited for hell, and you may never return to earth." Well, since then, the Smith of Mitterbach wanders. Nobody knows where, and he will have to continue his wanderings for all eternity. I don't care if this video doesn't do well or whatever else. I have been looking for a reason to tell that story for a while. I will admit. I am interested in Faust, and I do like the idea that Faust is a contrast. But it's hard to sell a story without giving away its details, right? People in chat are befuddled by this smith, how brazen he was. Jenna says this smith is wilding. Everyone is like, seriously, a third time? Anyways, that is all the stories I have tonight, but it is time for us to look at some notes from the translator of these tales. Not about these tales, though. These are going to be notes from another video. This is the section of the show called Translator's Notes, and it's where if a translator that I'm reading decides to add notes to my video or whatever, I will read them as soon as I can. I got a little behind on them for a while there. But I think I'm caught up now. Now, this note comes from Jürgen Hubert, who did translate the stories we read tonight, and is responding, though, to a video that I did about water monsters in German folklore, which got an unfortunately not the best response on a YouTube level, which is the algorithm. And you guys should definitely check out, because I think it has by far the creepiest, most violent story, if that's your thing, but they're not all that way. Which is about a serial killer spirit. Actually, wait a minute. No, this is not about the water, is it? I gotta double check. I can't. I'll check at the end. Yeah, I think it is. I think it's about monsters. Whatever. He says, highly enjoyable as always. Some comments. Jurgen says, if anyone draws anything based on these tales, he wants to see the result. I would too. If you guys decide to draw something from a tale, send it to me on Mastodon, or if you link me to something in the comments, I can certainly go and look at it there. Jurgen continues, I have found an alternative version of the Hidden Sea tale where the greedy woman pulls water from a well instead. Naturally, I knew immediately which version was the superior one. I suspect that alternate version was a later day... Oh, I remember the name of this video now. This was the woman who pees a lake, which is the title of it, and that is what the story's about. That one performed very well, but you should still watch it if you haven't. Carrying on with Jurgen's comment, I suspect that alternate version was a later day attempt at censorship, like what the Brothers Grimm's did in their later editions of their fairy tale collections. Now, this I was interested in. This is me speaking for a moment. We told a story of a city that had a very similar tale to Atlantis, sort of that kind of mythology. And at the time, I had forgotten what I'd read about it, and I could not recall whether it was a real city that has been mythologized or whether it was never a real city. And so this comment here is Jurgen clarifying that. Jurgen says, Veneta is about as real as Atlantis, which is to say there's no compelling evidence of its existence whatsoever, despite plenty of people looking for it in various places. Carrying on, which came from the Veneta story as well, the theme of bread sacrilege is a fairly strong and recurring theme in German folktales, complete with horrible divine punishments for the blasphemer. Wiping children clean with bread, which is a line in the story, likewise shows up more than once. Bread is seen as fairly sacred food in German culture, even apart from the altar bread. And I'm going to say something on that in a minute. And if you have ever eaten any good German bread, you will understand, says Jurgen. Proud of his country's food heritage. I wanted to add, so one of my more dominating hobbies in my life, I have several, as you may have noticed, is cooking. And when you read cooking books and stuff, you learn stuff. And bread is fascinating in cultures going all the way back to Rome. And part of what makes it it is an issue of contention in law. People who fake bread, like don't put fillers in, or would mark their breads wrong, or would sell bread that was older than you were allowed to sell. All of these things were people that would get hung, burned at the stake, were villainized in folklore well beyond Germany. And the reason for that was because bread was kind of how a lot of European cultures survived. By the time you start getting big cities in sort of cold northern forests that came from a generation of Romans, usually, it's hard to find enough food for everybody. But here's the thing. This is what the interesting fact is about bread. We take this for granted, but most people, for most of history, could not have an oven in their house. That was a very specialized, very hard to build kind of thing. And so, what bread represented was a community need that you should not waste because it was pricey and it was absolutely necessary for survival. And then later, because of like how much a community is built around bread baking and so on, what you start to see is bread becoming elevated, and Germany is a good example of that. If you ever wanted to really other someone in culture, you would accuse them of, in these stories, you would see it being accused of like mistreating bread in some way. It's I don't think I'm doing a very good job of like articulating here why it was important, but I think what I am trying to articulate is in this modern day and age, we might not quite understand how much of a community thing bread is. And that's why there were so many laws around them and so on, because everyone depended on their local baker every day, usually. That's also why there were so many recipes about old bread. And if you didn't live in a city, which lots of people didn't, you would have to travel pretty far to get bread. And so it became a somewhat special thing too. And then on top of that, there's the altar bread for those who aren't Christian in any way or have never been Christian. You know, it represents the body of Christ and you eat it. I mean, it varies a bit depending on where you go. But in general, that's the case. The blood being wine, the bread being body, and that elevates it to a holy status in mind. So bread is huge. If you're going forward and you hear any folklore, just know that bread is, I don't even know what would be a comparison in modern culture. Yeah, because like special food, like we're so spoiled for food and we have the ability to make everything. Like, I don't know how to articulate it. I can't think of an apt analogy for how important bread is. GS says in German bread is substantial. German bread is damn good. But honestly, there aren't a lot of bad breads, cultural breads out there. GS says bread is still a mainstay. I should say, I want to add, bread is not a universal thing. I'm being cautious to say, like, people that descended out of the Roman Empire and so on largely, you know, relied on various forms of bread. It does dominate a huge part of the world. But the equivalent in other cultures is not bread. Like, as you push more east on that continent, you get more rice, for example, which is more of a staple than wheat and bread. And you get mixtures in cultures as well. But they are grains that could be grown plentifully, could be prepared in a way that was flexible, and provided a lot of calories at a time where calories were scarce. And between all of those connection points, bread was not a thing to waste. GS says Asian countries, not really. Again, it kind of depends on the country. You know, you see a lot of flatbreads in Indian cooking, in other South Asian countries. You see, I mean, there's a reason for this, but I think it's worth mentioning a lot of Vietnamese culture picked up, let's say, a lot of French culture. Not necessarily by choice, but including French bread. So, you know, there is a mixture out that way, but rice is probably the more standard staple, and that's got all as much to do with the environments and who was dominant in the region. And food is an interesting rabbit hole. Much of the world can be understood if you understand food, I think. Anyways, I just wanted to build on that because it's a piece of knowledge that nobody ever cares about. So this was a chance for me to share it. Just how crucial a shared oven, that's what a baker was, to have their daily bread. I mean, you probably would starve to death without it, is really the point. Anyways. I have probably talked everyone's ear off enough. And anyways, my job now is to go and stoke the fire so that I can keep it going while you guys have a good sleep. Thank you, Jenna and GS, for hanging out with me today. Anybody who's lurking or watches later, thank you so much. Maybe consider giving this video a like. If you don't already, consider subscribing. Maybe telling a friend about it if you think they would enjoy it, because it certainly, those things mean the most to me. If you are able to, I do have a Ko-fi link down below where you can give me some financial support to help offset the costs of doing this, which it does indeed have costs, though they may not be obvious. But if you can't do that, you don't feel bad about that. I'm happy to have you here to hear stories that I feel like might die a dusty death on a shelf if they're not told. What a great one it was tonight. So I'll keep the fire going. You guys have a good sleep.